Hey guys, it's Olivie Blake, and this is me not writing. Okay, so clearly there's a glare in my glasses, which is unfortunate because I kind of need them to see. With the heat, I've been getting a lot of migraines, so I've been trying to, take it easy on my eyes. But so you don't have to stare at my own computer screen glaring back at me, I will take them off just for you. It's very hot still, so water. I don't know if you guys have watched AOC's little get ready video that she did for Vogue, but I was really impressed with her lipstick. She kissed her dog and nothing came off, whereas when I wear lipstick and I kissed my dog one time, actually I think he had, nope, it wasn't so tender as a kiss. He had sort of bucked his head up and run into my mouth, and so then there was some pink on his white fur, and so for a hot second the vet was like, does he have a rash? And I was like, no, that would just be me not wearing Stila Stay All Day liquid lipstick. So there's something we can learn from politics. Okay, I'm being glib, but really, her video was very, very good, and she is incredibly intelligent when speaking to her bathroom mirror, so envy abounds. What do we have today? Actually kind of a lot of stuff. So first of all, I wanted to say that I am going back to Mr. Brightside and the Atomic Bomb. I took a break after finishing The Princess's Guide to Popular Statecraft, and then I also wanted to wait for The Killer's new album to come out because I figured, I might want to use some of those songs, and I think that I probably will. So yeah, it's pretty good. I really like it. I mean, it's not the same as obviously their first album. I wouldn't say it's got a lot of bops, but it does feel very time appropriate. It's very, I guess, pensive. I know that Brandon Flowers worked with different musicians this time. He actually worked with a few more women this time. Not that you can hear that necessarily, but that was just a fun fact that I read. And yeah, I really like it, so give that album a try, especially because I will probably use some of the songs in Mr. Brightside and the Atomic Bomb if you're reading that. What else do we have? Oh yes, so this month's spell read, I haven't sat down to write the actual post, which normally that's how I figure out what I want to say about the book, is by putting it in writing first. I am a writer first. So let's see, what can I say about this book? I've read a lot of books recently that are weirdly personal, and this one is one of those where it was oh shit, I didn't expect to for this book to resonate so strongly with my personal experience, and now it has, and now I don't know how to talk about it because I know that a lot of my opinions on the book are rooted in my similarities, or the similarities of my life to this narrator's life, which is not usually how I try to judge a book. I would say that, I guess I should talk about the title, I should really do these things better. So You Exist Too Much by Zaina Arafat is, I almost want to call it a psychological thriller. Not that it's a thrill, but the way it was paced was really clever, where you kind of jump into this protagonist's life and she only reveals the significance of things as you go. You can sort of guess where some of her issues are coming from, but when she reveals them, it's aha, we've learned this really important thing about her. It's structured almost the way, I've described Leanne Moriarty's writing as domestic thrillers before, and I think what is thrilling, the thrill part, is the pace at which she reveals the information that you need. So it's not enough to give you the answer, but it is enough for you to kind of see the next few steps. It's you can see the next level in the video game, but you still can't see how it gets to the end. I would say the first 70% of this book was almost flawless. I really, really enjoyed the flaws of this protagonist. I thought she was interestingly flawed, and I loved that you could see where it was all coming from. I think for me, because characterization is such an important thing, even in my fan fictions, someone once asked me a question about the relationship between mother and son, and how you can see that the character is different in each story that I put him, depending on what his relationship with his mother is. And I thought that was such a great observation, because it is definitely something that I'm either making a point to think about, in the Commoner's Guide verse, we have the mother who's extremely, ironically narcissistic. But having a woman raised by a narcissistic mother causes this sort of very predictable psychological fallout, which was very obvious in You Exist Too Much. And it was really interesting to see what she thought of herself versus what other people thought of her. So there were the flaws that other people felt she had versus the flaws that she herself felt she had. And I thought that mismatch was like really well done. And then the narrative got like a little lost for me after the 70% point. It seemed like maybe then it became more about less about the narrator's like isolated experience while she was in that sort of rehab center. But that was the most interesting part, I felt. I also rewatched Rocket Man right after I read this book, and I was noticing the elements of the treatment for addiction is really to sort of metaphorically face your addiction. And I don't know if you've seen this film or if I'm just drawing two completely unrelated things together, but in the movie, Elton John faces his past selves and like his demons, basically, which is essentially what this narrator does in this book. And it was just really interesting to see those practices like portrayed theatrically and in literature, and then to see like that is really what healing actually looks like, which was just very interesting. I do like psychology a lot. I may have enjoyed this book more than you have, but let me know if you have any thoughts. I will have already posted it by the time this video posts. Yeah, I just noted for myself that like psychology, birth order, that is really important for characterization. And I think I have another question where we'll get into that, so we'll just skip ahead for now. Okay, so this is so exciting. Tumblr user LJB is pregnant, and I'm so excited. Congratulations if you're watching this, which I hope you are because I'm answering your question here. Congratulations on your pregnancy. I'm very happy to be part of it. Actually, one of my favorite things about fandom is knowing like which of my readers have had babies sort of along the way, or things that people have told me about their lives. I do remember them. As Taylor Swift would say, it's nice to have a friend. So, it's still super early. We haven't told anyone yet. I found out yesterday. Yes, I'm so excited. It's so nice to take up space in your life, she says, like a normal person. So the real question is, any tips on setting boundaries with overbearing parents on both sides? This could get messy. Oh, I feel you. So yes, this is my advice, and it is technically wedding planning advice, as I mentioned. It's true for everything. You could apply this to a lot of things. Basically, the thing is, people who want to get involved, that's their way of expressing love. So step number one is sort of to recognize that the way that the people in your life try to tell you that they love you can sometimes mean they try to get what you think is over-involved and what they think is just, lovingly involved. So the first thing to do is to recognize, for your own sake, that this is something that they feel they need to do, and that you rejecting it would be like rejecting their love. So you want to make sure that doesn't happen. You want to make sure you don't end up like exploding to the point where you're essentially saying, stay out of my life, I don't accept what you're giving me, because that can be very hurtful, even if you really, 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 really want them to stay out of it. This is definitely something I've had to come to terms with. My mother is very much the type of mother who, like, as I've been in adulthood, she seems to almost worry about me more. She used to send me emails that said things like, don't forget to stop at stoplights. Sometimes she'll text me to, like, tell me to drink water, like, it feels very strange. It feels like at this point, her parenting, like that sort of parenting should be sort of done with. Whereas sometimes when we have conversations and I want to talk to her like adult to adult, she's still talking to me like I'm a child who needs to be told what to do. And I feel like I have to jump over these hurdles and skip right to the no, like let's talk about this like grown people. She recently offered to, I was complaining about how long my insurance company was taking to get in contact with me, and she was like, why don't I call and pretend to be you? And I was like, Mother, I understand what you're trying to do. However, I'm an adult, and my healthcare is my responsibility. Thank you, but no thank you. Anyway, so first of all, accepting that this is their way of showing love might be important. Another thing is that I've mentioned in the past is that my mom likes to tell me that she's praying for me. I don't necessarily have the same religious beliefs that she does, but the fact that she's praying actually makes me feel good. It makes me feel like at least she is expressing her love for me in the way that she knows how. And sometimes you have to accept love the way that other people want to give it. Sometimes telling them how you want to receive love isn't going to work. This is a whole other thing, but just as far as, accepting what's being offered to you can take you sort of almost up to the halfway point of like getting over it. Not all the way. To get all the way there, what you want to do is give your parents, each set of parents, a task. And what you want to do is overemphasize the importance of that task. You want to give them something that's not important to you, as in if they just run away with it and do whatever they want, then it's still not going to upset you. For example, if you don't really care what your wedding invitations look like, you might want to hand this over to, say, your in-laws, your future in-laws, and say like, oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed by this. What typography do I choose? And like, I would just so love if you helped me with this, because then that way that allows them to take over the task so you don't have to worry about it. And it distracts them because they then think that that very important thing you've asked them to do is like very meaningful to you. I don't know what that task would be with a baby, but you know, if you could assign someone to something, you know, something that doesn't necessarily, if there are things that are very important to you, you probably just want to downplay those so that you can keep them to yourself, versus the things that are not very important, you can allow your parents to get over involved in those things. This is actually a very simple trick. This is one of my more like manipulative things, so apologies in advance if you do feel that that is manipulative of me. But, you know, I just think it's one of those things where it's a win-win situation. You get to have your own space, you get to care about what's important to you, and your family gets to feel like they're contributing something, even if that contribution is mostly just staying out of your way. I'm not sure what that would be for babies. I don't really know much about babies. But, you know, especially if you can give something, if you have if one of your parents like loves to research things, give them something to research, like obsessively research, because that is really, truly, that is their way of showing you that you're important to them, that you're taking up space in their hearts and in their minds, and that is very valuable. So rather than pushing them away, point them in the direction of something that isn't going to drive you crazy. For me, for my wedding, just for reference, I actually asked my mother-in-law to help me with like gift bags for the guests, and she did an amazing job. And so it was something I didn't have to worry about that turned out incredible, and because she was working on that, she didn't necessarily have to get involved in other things like, say, the guest list. So yeah, I hope that helps. I just noticed my like bra is showing. I'm even wearing a bra. This is very impressive for everyone, mostly me. Okay, only me, but like, we're saying a lot here. Hi, Olivie. I think I remember you mentioning Nick Jonas talking about his music making process on a show. Yes, so I once talked about, I don't remember when I talked about it or where, but I have previously really liked the show Songland, which is about songwriters. It's basically like the artist who needs to add songs to their in-progress album has a bunch of songwriters come in and pitch them these songs, and they sing like their original demos and stuff, and then the artist kind of, and 3 producers basically work with the songwriters to create a song that they think the artist might perform. And Nick Jonas in particular was very active in like, this is how he would want it to be performed, this is the production of the song was the really interesting part, because it's the part I don't really know about. You know, you hear the song and it's easy to hear the lyrics, but it's not so easy to hear like, when do the drums come in? And sometimes they'll talk about things like, oh, this is a very like 2014 beat, and it's like, okay, I guess maybe I could acknowledge it now that I've been told that, but I love to see how things are made, especially when it's, you know, a creative, when it's a craft. I talk about writing all the time as a craft, as an art. So watching other artists at work kind of inspires me to change my creative process, or not change, but adapt and try new things. And also, I think most importantly, pay attention to what I'm actually doing. So like when I was talking about characterization earlier and paying attention to like child psychology and stuff, I think initially I wasn't aware that I was doing that. And now when I'm doing like the early stages for a book and figuring out characterization, asking myself, what are these characters' parents like, is kind of the first step. Or what, you know, where are they in their family? Are they an only child? Are they the youngest? Are they in the middle? What does that say about them? What does it mean that they crave? So kind of my awareness of that is the same as Nick Jonas's awareness that this is where a falsetto harmony would be best, which comes from practice. So it's fun to watch someone who is very good at what they do, doing what they do, because then you kind of get an idea for things you wouldn't pay attention to normally, which is not answering the question. because it's a hard question to answer. I've watched Taylor Swift's songwriting videos and Halsey's as well, where they explain like where certain lyrics come from or why they phrase things that way. Basically, listening to anyone explain why they choose to do something means kind of awakening to the idea that it is a conscious choice. And what I really like about that is the awareness that like creativity is not just some magical accident. Like, yeah, a lot of it is the muse kind of showing up and doing something crazy in your head. I mean, definitely writing is the closest I will ever come to making magic. Sometimes I'll write something and have no idea where it came from. But at the same time, putting the work in and knowing where that work is going in and the experience of doing it over and over makes it the craft versus the miracle of creativity. When you watch other people paying attention to their craft, whether it's music or songwriting or sometimes artists. I've talked before about how a novel, like when you're planning a novel, it's the same as when a piece of artwork has an underpainting, that you do some amount of work to structure what's going to come out at the end, even if what comes out at the end is genius. You know, there's still like, there's the underpainting, or with, cross stitch, you flip it over and you can see how things are connected. I don't know that I can explain exactly why that's helpful, but it does help me to understand, I guess mainly that things don't just come together. Everything is incremental. Everything is smaller pieces. And making the conscious choice to pay attention to those small pieces and noticing how other people put those pieces together helps me break down something that feels like a very large task, which is actually kind of going into our next question. So even though I didn't answer this one very well, we're going to skip to that. So this person asked me, how do you develop a small idea into an entire story? In my experience, I have trouble expanding on my thoughts. How do you get past this? This is a question I answer literally all the time, so I'm sure I've given better or more complete answers in the past. But I think that I'm just going to make the same point I've been making, which is that a book is not a first draft. And this is something I'm really learning now. I got about 20,000 words into a manuscript that I'm working on right now that I feel is not what I want it to be, and I've tried sort of pivoting a few ways, and I think that the idea is good, and the way that it's happening is I'm not playing to my strengths very well. So I'm at a point where I would have to scrap a lot of what I've written and start over, or kind of go with another idea I'm having that I think is a little bit more, it's even less of an idea, which is funny. I think this is why I'm willing to talk about this, is because I'm in this stage of development where I have almost no idea at all. But what I do have is a concept of tone, which I think is the place you have to start. You have to start with, previously I talked about starting with setting. You have to know the setting and kind of an idea of the character's voice. And you can start from there, and you really have to think of what you're doing as drafting. You have to think about this as your underpainting. So the idea of, I have trouble expanding on my thoughts, that's probably because you're thinking of it in terms of, I want to create a novel, which you're going to do. Well, I don't know if it's a novel, but let's assume it's a novel. You're going to eventually have a novel on your hands. But what you have to have first is a first draft that you then are going to reconstruct, and it's going to become a second draft, and then it's going to become a third draft, and however many drafts and however many rounds of revisions before it becomes the novel. So first of all, for me, in my experience, the very first thing you have to do is sit down and write. I could sit here and try to meditate until a full plot comes to me. Or I could just start writing and see what happens and see what comes to me. That is the fun part of writing, and I don't want to take the fun part away, which is, I think, what was happening to me with my previous draft, where I had a pretty fleshed out idea of a plot, but I was trying to do too much with it. In practice, it wasn't really working. The voice wasn't fully there, I think because I was pushing too hard for a voice that wasn't the one that I wanted to occupy. Another thing is, like, as a writer, you have to kind of go with what's pushing on your muse, usually because it has to do with what's going on in your life and where you are emotionally, and it's really not helping you to work with an idea that doesn't spark something. Not necessarily joy, but I think generally if this is something that you're thinking a lot about, then you have to you have to go with what you're thinking about. At some point, obviously, that crosses into having the discipline to actually finish a project, because that is the long story of this, is you have to practice building a small, almost nothing idea into a whole book. But you'd be surprised, how easily you can do that. I think that there is a misconception that you have to have a certain amount of a story planned out before you can sit down and write it. I don't think that's true. I think that maybe it's easier for some people. For me, it takes all the fun out of it. And I think that's what I kind of accidentally did with this last idea, was that I kind of set the bar for preparation at an unrealistic place, to the point where now when I sit down to actually write it, I feel like what's actually coming out is uninspired and sort of unresponsive. It doesn't feel like what I want to be working on. And this has happened a couple of times, and so it's one of these things where I'll probably come back to this idea. I think it will be more relevant to my life at another time. The idea I'm having now, I think, is the one I'm going to go with. And I have essentially meditated myself enough to the point where I don't know what the plot is. I do, however, know what my character's starting motivation is. I know what she feels like in chapter 1. Which gives me enough to write chapter 1. And then I'm going to have to rely on my muse / my demon to continue writing after that. But I'm going to have to fall back on my experience with practice. I'm at a point where I've got my 10,000 hours of writing in. And so knowing that, I have a good idea of how to efficiently use my time, which is something I talk about a lot, writing efficiently. Because a lot of writing is just putting in the sweat and knowing how much you can sweat and how much preparation you need, why do I always bring this back to sports metaphors, but how much you need to stretch before you run that marathon. So how do you develop a small idea into an entire story? You just do it. You just do it, and then you do it again, and then you do it again, and you just keep doing it. And you learn something each time you do it, this is why these two questions were kind of related to each other, is because it's worth noting which parts are difficult specifically so that you know how to address them in the future. Because ideally, you're not just doing this isn't just an exercise in futility. You want to learn from your successes, and you also want to learn from your failures. Where do things fall apart, and how can you prevent that from happening next time? So I think for me, what I'm learning from this draft that I'm putting aside is I had too much of an idea of what I wanted the plot to be without understanding the characters. And now that I'm writing it, the characters and the plot aren't matching up. They don't make sense. It's almost like I have the wrong character in my head, and that this character in my head should be doing something else. So that's kind of what I'm doing, is like pivoting. So I've got this voice in my head that needs to be written because it's in my head, and it won't let me rest. And the plot that I had chosen doesn't suit it, so let's just see what happens. I will probably, after I've written, maybe 2 or 3 introductory chapters, stop and reassess and think about how much do I need to know before I move forward in order to really take advantage of what I've established, what needs to be established before we can move forward. At that point, I have to know what the overarching plot is, and maybe a thread or 2 of subplot. I need to know who all the minor characters are going to be. I mean, certainly by that point I would be familiar with what the major characters sound like, but I'd also maybe want to know who's going to enter the story, and at what point they should enter, at what point they should, their storyline should peak. That's something that you write and you stop and you reassess. I think my ratio with the Atlas 6 was I would stop through an 1/8 of a book. And I think with My Mechanical Romance, I would say that book is shorter, so I reassessed it probably in 4ths. But yeah, so just don't think of something don't think of it as the final product, because the final product is it's built with a lot of tiny, tiny pieces. It's built on every single day that you sit down and you write something that seems impossible when you sit down to write it. You will surprise yourself as you write, because it's a creative process. And who you are when you sit down to write it changes from day to day, probably. So yeah, the answer is practice. There is no secret. The secret is that you are the best writers are just master bricklayers who have laid brick thousands and thousands and thousands of times to the point where they can see when a brick is sticking out and they have to fix something. I don't know how to actually lay bricks, so I don't know if that metaphor stands. But don't think of every book as like the finished masterpiece. You have to think of it first as your first draft, as the thing that you're going to keep, nurturing as you go. It's going to be hard and it's probably going to be not great, but that doesn't mean that your final product won't be great. So even though it feels insurmountable now, you can do it. That seems that felt bad. But that's what it is. Okay, so I'm going to sit down and do this spell post now. And hopefully I will come up with something clever to say. I'm going to put my glasses back on because my eyes are killing me. It's headache season. So yeah. Anyway, this has been me, Olivie Blake, not writing, and I'll see you next week.